What happened to President Trump designating Antifa as domestic terrorists? Those words sound wonderful. I was very relieved when I heard President Trump designate Antifa as domestic terrorists. I thought, good. Finally, we're going to actually see federal law enforcement dismantle this network of radical anti-American groups who use violence to try to harm you and overthrow the American government. That's what I felt the day that President Trump designated Antifa as domestic terrorists. But to this day, since then, to this day, the only terrorism charges brought against any Antifa members is charges for providing material support or resources. Two individuals, Cameron Arnold and Zachary Evitz, were charged with these terror enhancements over the ICE shooting in Texas. That's it. What happened? In the days after Charlie Kirk's assassination, when Vice President J.D. Vance hosted Charlie's radio show from the White House campus, he had Stephen Miller on as one of his guests, and Stephen Miller describes his last communication with Charlie Kirk. Stephen Miller says, one of our last exchanges was Charlie Kirk expressing the urgency for the Trump administration to dismantle these radical leftist networks, because these aren't isolated incidents. These aren't just some one radicalized random crazy. This is a coordinated, funded effort to sow violence and harm conservatives. And Stephen Miller said that was the last conversation I had with Charlie Kirk before Charlie Kirk was killed by the very people that he described. And on that day, Stephen Miller said to Vice President J.D. Vance on Charlie Kirk's radio show, he said, I will fight to dismantle these radical leftist networks for the rest of my life. What happened to that? Where is that? Listen, I get it. A lot of the onus lies on Berkeley police and on city police. They're charged with protecting the individuals, the conservatives on college campus. They're supposed to be the ones who are the front lines of maintaining law and order. And where were they? They weren't arresting very many people. They arrested the conservative and they arrested the women who hung the bug. But what about the people firing off the flares? What about the driver of the car that was backfiring, intentionally frightening a crowd, deliberately making people think that there were shots being fired? What about the people yelling, F your homie and fascists are here at Berkeley? What about all of the disruptions, no matter how small? Like, you step on a piece of grass that you're not supposed to step on. If you're Antifa Black Bloc, you should be arrested. The Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the Justice Department, that's Harmeet Dillon. We love her on this show. She's wonderful. She was wonderful as a civilian attorney. She's wonderful in government. She posted this. She said, we saw all of this at Berkeley back in 2017. UC Berkeley was sued and settled the case. The Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice will investigate what happened here, and I see several issues of serious concern regarding campus and local security and Antifa's ability to operate with impunity in California. That's wonderful. I am so grateful to hear that from Assistant Attorney General Harmeet Dillon. That is great. But here's the thing. It's not enough. It will never be enough if you are playing a game of whack-a-mole. It will never be enough if you are addressing this problem one person at a time only after the infraction or the violence has been committed. Antifa will continue to be emboldened. They will continue to commit violence until and unless there is a thorough dismantling from the top down. And I know Antifa likes to say that they don't have any organizational structure. They're a decentralized network. They're just an idea, they say. BS. This is also what the mafia said, by the way, decades ago. And just like with the mafia, unless you bring down the whole organization, 50, 100 arrests, not just one-offs when they get violent, it's not going to solve the problem. Remember 2 weeks ago when we had journalist Brandy Cruz on the show, and she's been covering Antifa in the Northwest for a decade now. She used to be a leftist, but when she started seeing how the mainstream media lied about, the Antifa autonomous zones in Portland, Oregon, she said, well, if the mainstream media is lying about the reality of what Antifa is actually doing, and Antifa physically assaulted Brandy Cruz, so she had personal experience with the reality of what Antifa is. She said, if the mainstream media and the left are lying about Antifa, what else are they lying about? And she realized the answer to that is everything. They lie about everything. And she's somewhat of an expert on Antifa because she's been embedded in the areas where Antifa is rampant for so many years. And she told us when she was on the show that the Antifa organizational structure, about 10% of the Antifa militants are committed violent revolutionaries. They are willing to kill and be killed for their cause, their communist cause. And that's scary. That's a frightening prospect. This means that we're dealing with a significant domestic enemy. But she also said that 90% of these Antifa thugs who turn out at these protests are cowards, that they would disappear if they believed that they would face any accountability for their behavior. And right now, they don't have any reason to believe that they will face any accountability for their behavior. So the question is, what can the Justice Department do about this? And again, I'm grateful for Harmeet Dillon looking at what happened on UC Berkeley and saying, I see problems here and we'll address this. That's good. I'm happy to see Antifa violence addressed on a case-by-case basis. But if you actually want to solve the Antifa problem, then you need to break up the organization, and there's a playbook to do so. Back in September in the Oval Office, President Trump himself, this is not a novel idea that I'm presenting to you. This is something that's been discussed. The words have been said by the leaders of our country. We just have yet to see the actions following those words. Back in September in the Oval Office, President Trump himself said that the Department of Justice is looking at RICO charges for groups, left-wing, violent groups like Antifa. Take a look at this.
Antifa is terrible.
Are there other groups that you can pick up?
There are other groups, yeah, there are other groups. We have some pretty radical groups, and they got away with murder. And also, I've been speaking to the Attorney General about bringing RICO against some of the people that you've been reading about that have been putting up millions and millions of dollars for agitation. These aren't protests. These are crimes, what they're doing, where they're throwing bricks at cars of ICE and Border Patrol. And they come in with a beautiful new car. They're so proud. It's Border Patrol, ICE, it's got whatever it is. And they're throwing rocks at it. And after 50 yards, it looks like an old beat-up vehicle. It was just brand new. It was just bought for the purposes. And they don't have to take that anymore. I let it be known. We'll take responsibility. They don't have to take it anymore. And they don't want to take it. They were told by a past administration, it became almost a culture, if somebody throws a rock at you, do nothing. If somebody spits in your face, do nothing. And I say, when they spit, you hit. Do whatever you want. You do whatever the hell you want. I watched it so sick it made me. For 4 years, I had to sit home and watch people screaming at policemen and spitting in their face, and they weren't able to do anything. They just had a grin and bear it. They're standing up like a piece of steel. And a woman, in many cases, women, you can see they're professional agitators. I had one the other night. I had 4 the other night, all in one group, total phonies. I started to scream when I got into a restaurant, something with Palestine. And I said, well, I'm doing a great job for peace in the Middle East. I should get lots of awards for that, right? With the Abraham Accords and everything else. But a woman just stood up and started screaming. And she got booed out of the place, too. There were a lot of people in the restaurant. I went there to show how safe, and it was safe. I mean, the woman is just a mouthpiece. All she was a paid agitator. And you have a lot of them. And I've asked Pam to look into that in terms of RICO, bringing RICO cases against the criminal RICO, because they should be put in jail. What they're doing to this country is really subversive.
So you hear these words, and I mean, you can see my reaction. You hear these words, and you're like, this man gets it. President Trump gets it. He has articulated exactly what's happening. He's articulated a plan a viable, I mean, I don't want to call it an easy plan because none of this is easy, but the case is so cut and dry. It's so obvious that this would be a conviction case. And yet this was back in September. Where is this? There is no reason that foreign communist funded violence should be tolerated on U.S. soil. There is no excuse. No, they have a right to free speech. That doesn't apply to Antifa, because what Antifa is doing is not saying words. They're committing violence. You are not allowed, even under the First Amendment, to incite imminent violence. You are not allowed to assault police officers. You are not allowed to push down police barricades. You are not allowed to take money from, if you are designated a terrorist organization, as Antifa is, you're not allowed to take money from Chinese Communist Party affiliated actors like Roy Singham in order to foment violence on U.S. streets and on U.S. college campuses. You have no constitutionally protected right to do that. And yet Antifa hides behind this narrative that the mainstream media conveniently propagates for them, that they're decentralized network. They're just, how do you go after an organization that isn't really an organization? I'll tell you how. Let's go back to 1970 for a second. During the Nixon presidency, in the early 1970s, and even later into the 1970s and 80s, members of the mob, the mafia, used to say the exact same thing. They said, the mafia doesn't exist. The mob doesn't exist. It's a mythical group. It's a Hollywood fairy tale. You know, it's just popularized by the Godfather movies. It's not a thing. What are you talking about? If this sounds familiar, it's because Antifa uses the exact same playbook. And so what Congress did in response to this, because we all knew that the mob was real, the mafia was real, an organized crime syndicate, what Congress did is they passed RICO. They passed RICO. RICO is a law that allows the federal government to go after organized criminal enterprises like the mob or like Antifa, even when they don't technically have a membership role. So, for example, before RICO was passed, the Department of Justice had a difficult time making any charges stick on the mob bosses, because the mob bosses were very careful to keep a lot of layers of personnel between them and the foot soldiers who actually carried out the crimes, so that there appeared to never be any direct ties between the boss and the crimes committed, even though he was the one giving the directions. So you're familiar with this. You know the mob. The hierarchical structure was like this. There was a boss at the top, then there was the underboss, then there was the capos, the captains between the underboss, and then the soldiers who worked for each capo. And beneath the soldiers were the associates who collaborated with members of the organization, provided even more distance, more deniability between the mob members and the criminal activities. And this made it really difficult for law enforcement to ever actually crack down on the organizational structure of the mafia. Once in a while, they'd catch someone committing the crime, but they could never catch the person who commissioned the crime until RICO. After RICO was passed, the government could prove that there were criminal organizations, and they could charge anyone involved in the organization when anyone in the organization or associated with the organization committed a crime. Think about the 1980s, New York City under Rudy Giuliani. He used RICO to prosecute and take down the mafia. And what happened? Crime drastically reduced. RICO, by the way, for those asking, stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. And RICO applies almost to a letter to Antifa, because Antifa operates almost exactly like the mob did. There are several elements that need to be satisfied, behavioral elements that need to be satisfied before you can be charged with a RICO violation. You have to have the existence of an enterprise. That's just a group of people or entities associated together for a common purpose. And it doesn't have to be a formal structure. It doesn't have to be like a corporation or a union or anything. It can be informal, like a street gang or just loose associations of people. But there has to be a structure. There has to be a structure beyond just, people getting together committing crimes. Does Antifa satisfy that element? Well, of course they do. They're a group of individuals who share a common goal, who commit crimes together. Then the second element, the enterprise must affect interstate or foreign commerce, even minimally. Well, this is always satisfied because all you have to do is use a phone or like a bank or a highway or send mail or something, and that's interstate commerce. Okay, element 1 satisfied, element 2 satisfied. The defendant, the person being charged, the association, that defendant's association with the enterprise, that defendant must be employed by or associated with the enterprise, but it doesn't require formal membership. Just participation is enough. Also easy to satisfy. Think of these individuals who commit the crimes against the police officers. They're not doing that on their own. The fourth element, participation in the conduct of the enterprise's affairs. The defendant, in order to be charged, must participate in either the operation or the management of the enterprise. Now, outsiders can be liable if they direct any affairs, but you have to be part of this structure. But again, if you're thinking, wow, these are all extremely easy elements to meet, these standards, well, yes, it is, because all that you have to do is go to an Antifa safe house. You know, you have to be part of the Antifa safe house. You are participating in the operation. You hand out flyers. You're participating in the operation. You take part in the chants. You're participating in the operation. And then, of course, the final element to satisfy a RICO charge is a pattern of racketeering activity. So what does that mean? That means that there has to be 2 acts of racketeering activity. They're called predicate acts within the past 10 years. This is anything from murder to kidnapping to gambling, arson, robbery, bribery, extortion. There are 35 predicate acts in total. Again, super easy to satisfy when it comes to Antifa because all they do is commit crimes. All they do is commit crimes. And there has to be some kind of continuity and relationship between the individual and the organization. And then the organization is, in fact, liable for the crimes committed by the individual when that individual is part of the decentralized network that we aren't really a thing, we just operate as a thing. If we want to stop Antifa violence in our country, if we are actually tired of being called bugs and being assaulted, if we want to prevent the assassination of other conservatives for the crime of being conservative, then we can't play whack-a-mole. We can't simply be a reactive force, filing charges when there's violence that's already been committed. We have to undercut and dismantle the very organizations that plot this violence in our country. And the words that I hear from the Trump administration, they're great. I hear those words from Stephen Miller talking about how he is committed until his dying day of dismantling these organizations. And I say, thank you, Stephen Miller. We need someone like that. I hear President Trump, and I think he understands this. But where are the actions that follow those words? I get it. Investigations take time. All of these elements have to be proven. My hope is that the investigators are currently hard at work right now, and they will, at some point in the near future, unveil a absolute solid case against Antifa. That's my hope. But here's what we need. In the absence of confirmation that what we hope is happening is actually happening, we need to hear something from our government. We need to hear directly from President Trump that they're not just speaking words, that these actions are taking place. Because we, as conservatives, as supporters in this shared America First mission with President Trump, we are sitting ducks. And the president knows this. The president's the one who took a bullet to the ear because of this shared America First vision. He is also targeted. We need President Trump's voice to tell us, to instill in us a confidence that our Justice Department sees Antifa as the threat to our way of life that they are. And that we're not just going to hear the words to pacify us, but we will soon see, following the words, justice served. And not as a game of whack-a-mole, but as a thorough dismantling of these networks, these interconnected, highly funded, anti-American, violent networks that want us dead.